All right, we're live, and I would like to welcome all of you to this new session organized by the Global Supply Chain Council. We are very pleased to have you all joining us from, pretty diverse geography, and we have our members, of course, in the APAC region, but we also have people coming from the Middle East and Europe. So again, a great big welcome to all of you. So my name again is Max Henry. I'm the founder and the executive director of the Global Supply Chain Council. And today we're very pleased to have our speaker, our trainer, Stephen Morse, who's the founder of Unchained Solution. The session topic, the theme of this event, of this discussion is called Beyond the Backlash, the New Rules of ESG Leadership. So I want to again remind all of you that this can be an interactive session. So if you have any questions for Stephen, you can do so. You can ask your question by clicking on the question mark button at the bottom of the screen. So feel free to ask your question at any time. Stephen is going to be delivering a presentation for around 20-25 minutes. And after that, we will take all your questions one by one, and Stephen will be happy to answer them. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to again welcome Stephen Morse, who is the founder of Unchained Solution. Welcome, Stephen. Go ahead. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Max. Well, good evening from me. I'm calling in from Sydney, Australia. So we're just coming up to just gone 6 o'clock. So it's great to be here and great to be able to share with all of you. Just a little bit by background. So I run Unchained Solutions. So we're a consulting firm based in Sydney, and we work across the ESG landscape in terms of offering strategic planning, policy development, and advice on what companies need to do, both large and small, in regards to ESG reporting. We're also a solution provider in the area of human rights due diligence. That's our main sort of sandpit, working to help companies to report into different due diligence mechanisms throughout the world, principally the Modern Slavery Act in Australia. So it's good to be here today. I am very much interested in your perspective. So as Max has iterated, to put your comments in the chat, just also to understand your perspective on this topic around sort of beyond the backlash. How are you perceiving things? What is your perspective on this issue as we grapple with issues around sustainability and how we can make a positive impact on people and planet? So let me share my screen and we will get into the presentation.
Yeah, and if you're just joining us again, I want to remind all of you that this is going to be an interactive session. Stephen is going to present for about 20-25 minutes this presentation, and then after that, we will take your questions. So if you have any questions for Stephen, make sure to click on the question mark button and located at the bottom of the screen. Okay, go ahead, Stephen. Welcome.
Thank you very much. All right, so just a bit of an overview of what we're going to look at today. We'll just do a brief overview of what ESG is and what it means, and we'll look into three impact areas. There's a lot we could talk about, and we don't have a lot of time, so we'll just touch on the emissions and climate change conversation, modern slavery and human trafficking, and then cyber security and financial crime. That sort of takes us across the E, S, and G buckets. We'll then look at the global reporting mechanisms and then have a conversation around the push and pullback, or pushback and pullback sort of factors, and that might lead us in terms of time. We may be up to just then opening that up to a conversation rather than just a strict presentation at that point. So just by way of getting into this topic, just want to give a case study around this ship called AG Neptune. It's a Liberian-owned ship. And this ship, this is way back in 2022. This ship was arrested off the coast of Australia in New South Wales, where I'm based, after the fuel company Viva Energy attempted to stop it leaving Australian waters. The ship was originally sent to the state of Queensland, so that's further north, and it had 62,000 tonnes of diesel fuel. It was all bound for the port in Newcastle in New South Wales, Australia. And there was alleged contamination by water of that fuel worth around 75 million Australian dollars, probably around 45 million US dollars. And the ship had been loaded in Taiwan. Upon inspection, it was discovered that there were 21 seafarers on board that were suffering working conditions that contravene maritime labour convention, including collectively owed more than 120,000 Australian dollars. Moreover, the maritime authorities discovered that the seafarers' food, water, and their medical supplies were not to standard, and therefore collectively then they were suffering a range of human rights violations. As a result, the Australian Maritime Authorities then banned the ship for up to 3 months. Sorry, for 6 months, 880 days. And that was the first, probably the largest, the first time that had happened in such a long time. And then the story ran out of the media. Now, the reason I bring this as a way of introduction is because we were brought in one of our clients who uses Viva Energy, whose fuel was on that ship, as one of their key suppliers, actually their largest supplier. And so they were concerned about what kind of controls, what kind of governance, risk management controls are in place to mitigate these risks. And if we think about all the stakeholders involved in the supply of this fuel, we have the ship itself, which is Liberian, the charter company, which was from the United Kingdom. We have the fuel, which was from an Australian company. The ship was refueled in Taiwan. And then we have our client, who's an Australian entity. And so there's lots of stakeholders involved in this, and really points to through our investigation of these entities, we really discovered that the only entity that didn't have any controls that were publicly available was actually the ship itself. But all the other stakeholders, the charter, the fuel company, had all the controls and were signed up to the maritime conventions. And what that really points to is just that when it comes to two things, really, when it comes to conducting due diligence and managing risks, human rights and environmental risks, things happen, mistakes occur, there can be gaps. And so it's not, when it comes to due diligence, it's not a set and forget, it's about constant monitoring and reporting. And also too, just really showing the relationship between human rights and the environment. And so it's wrong for us to separate these two, and we'll see that as we step further into understanding what ESG is about. So you may be aware that ESG stands for environmental, social and governance. It's a bit of an awkward term and does kind of lend itself to needing another word like reporting or activities or mechanisms. And it's really a reporting framework for businesses to operate in a transparent, environmentally and socially responsible way, and to practice good governance. It's a way of just structuring things, so it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. It has a history in corporate social responsibility. It's been around for several years, and probably for today's conversation, it's a term which is waning in currency. What it's about is relevant and current, but the term itself, I think, is lacking interest, and we do need probably to think about how we can talk about these issues in a much more constructive way, given the current backlash. So that's something to keep in mind for our conversation. If we sort of drill down in some of those buckets, when we think of the environment, which is the most talked about in terms of political discourse internationally, we're talking about the use of natural resources, energy efficiency and usage, circular economy, water management, carbon footprint, water use and pollution. In the social bucket, we're talking about how the concern for people. So at one level, it's about workplace health and safety, it's about human rights, it's about diversity, equity, inclusion, and supply chain relationships, and thinking through questions around Indigenous, the impact on the Indigenous populations and the impact on children and child labour. In the governance side, at one level, it's around boards and board composition and affirmative action for representation across gender. But it's also more specifically these days about some really important topics to do with cybersecurity and data privacy, and the flow of money. So it's sort of the fintech dimensions of governance, which have implications for the environmental and social as well. So as we go through, we're going to just deep dive and just bring up some case studies. What does this actually mean? Some examples that we can actually point to. So I just want to point to, first of all, this story. It dates back to the 2010s, and it's a story that relates to a paper and pulp mill in Australia, in the state of Tasmania, right down at the bottom of the world. And really, this issue just highlights the intersection between environmental and social governance in action, because it talks to how different stakeholders, and particularly the government, actually address this issue. So this project was planned in the early 2000s. It was a $22 billion initiative intended to boost Tasmania's pulp and paper industry. However, it quickly became one of Australia's most controversial industrial proposals. The mill faced intense backlash due to several environmental concerns, potential deforestation, chemical waste, and significant air emissions. Local communities, scientists, and environmental groups raised serious questions about the ecological footprint and long-term sustainability of setting up a paper and pulp mill in the state. And it really became one of a critical ESG lesson of how environmental risk transforms into financial reputational risks. And as the controversy enveloped, banks and investors pulled out, and the project was ultimately shelved in 2011. And just really shows that, when it comes to, it's no longer important just to meet compliance. Companies need to, in a sense, earn a social license in order to operate. When we think more broadly about the environmental concerns and moving into emissions, we can see that overall there's been a rise in CO2, meaning on average, so that this is not something which is shrinking globally, that our CO2 emissions are growing year by year. And even though there's some work that's been done, particularly in the last 10, 15 years to reduce emissions, to bring us back to net zero, given the development of countries, for example, like China and India and other countries like Brazil, the BRIC nations, then global emissions are also continually to be on the rise. And when we break that down, we can break that down into different industries. So power industry, industrial combustion, processes, buildings, transport. We can see that on average, then we're seeing rises. When we compare year to year. And when we look at who are the greatest emitters, we can see that China, USA, India, and the EU 27, so that's the European Union, Russia and Brazil were the world's largest GHG emitters in 2023, and accounting for 49.8% of global population. So 63.2% of global gross domestic product, 64.2% of global fossil fuel consumption. So this, I suppose, the question and the issue that we're facing is not going away. We are increasing our global footprint, in terms of emissions, and therefore the question is, what are we going to? How do we address this? Particularly in the current climate, where there is a pushback, particularly leading that is the United States and the Trump administration, which on one level may seem like a temporary measure, given the tenure of the US presidency, but we're in the current climate, we're not actually in any way at all taking enough steps to address this issue. There's a bit of a pushback which is holding us back from addressing this issue. Having said that, though, in many jurisdictions, and in particular in the Australian context, we have new regulations, new standards coming into place as part of the Corporations Act here. We have climate-related financial disclosures, and this has already started as of 2025, where the largest companies are needing to actually report and disclose climate-related financial risks to the Australian government. And this is a trend which will then, in a sense, be triaged across different sectors and different industries and different sizes of companies over the next few years. So regardless of actually maybe what's happening internationally, globally, there is legislation in place to address this at the local level in certain jurisdictions, including Australia, and for companies to actually be accountable for the risks to their business and how they're actually measuring that. So there you can see 4 pillars of disclosure. They need to disclose the governance side, the board oversight, what is the impact business model, how what is that actually, disclosing what that looks like in terms of how they're actually addressing the processes they've put in place around risk management, and how they're considering different levels of scope. So scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, scope 3 being the most complicated, where it pertains to their value chain and principally their suppliers, and accounting for that as well. So there's a lot of work that's being done, and commencing in contexts like the Australian context and elsewhere, regardless of the growth and also the pushback as well. So in terms of different responses, and here I'll just I might move on because of time, due to time, but we can see then that there are different levels of commitment. Commitments are up from the Australian context, but one of the most complex areas being only 22% have set targets for scope 3. So this is probably the last point on the screen, is just where there is the most urgency and also the most complexity as well. Moving on to the next issue, and that has to do with, in the social space, has to do with modern slavery. And here in front of us, we can see an image of a collapsed factory. This is Rana Plaza in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Back in 2013, this factory collapsed. And it housed many, multi-level factory where major fashion brands had their produce being made. And this issue really put a spotlight on the whole apparel and fashion industry in terms of what kind of protections were being in place to make sure that workers were being looked after. In the lead up to this collapse, many of the women working in the building had noticed increased cracks in the walls and a sense of instability in the overall infrastructure of the building. And then on the morning of the collapse, management actually forced all the women back into the building, and then it collapsed, killing more than 1,100 women. So this kind of issue really put a spotlight, particularly on the fashion industry, and questions have been asked as we had the 10th year anniversary of that in 2023. Are we doing enough to protect workers? Are we doing enough to make sure that the environment in which they work in is safe? And because this kind of issue points not just to obviously the disruption to business in a context like Bangladesh, but also what's going on in terms of protecting people who work in those contexts. In terms of definitions, modern slavery is the commodification of people for the purpose of exploitation and financial gain. And it's a term which is not universally applied. It really is at sort of the most acute end of workplace exploitation, and really represents a lack of choice, movement, and voice. The term is used legislatively in, say, the Australian context and in the United Kingdom to talk as an umbrella term to describe a range of human rights violations, and they all intersect and play into each other. So a person, for example, who perhaps is disadvantaged, falls into poverty, needs to borrow money, can find themselves in debt bondage, and through that process then can be easily trafficked and then forced into a situation of forced labour, say in a factory or on a farm or in fisheries or forestries, or into forced servitude, which is a more domestic type of exploitation. Companies who need to address modern slavery face the challenge of actually really identifying what is a case of modern slavery, because it's very hard to get sort of a clear picture of what that looks like. And so we need to really look at the key indicators, and we have some of those indicators on the screen in terms of what companies need to consider. A key issue in risk has to do with recruitment. So that's the gateway to employment, and that's where people can face all sorts of fees for being recruited. They can be in excess of, say, a few thousand US dollars, and that is the point at which they can then find themselves needing to borrow money and be bonded, some sort of debt bondage scenario, which then sets themselves up for all other forms of exploitation in the process. when we think about how this issue is being tackled globally over the last 15 years, we've seen a rise in reporting mechanisms, the first being in the state of California in 2010, which is probably seen as the weakest legislation at these days in terms of what companies need to do. The legislation is maturing, and so that some of the strongest legislation is now being developed, one being the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and Due Diligence Directive. So as you can see, then the legislation is moving from simply reporting or acts to more directives and more emphasis on this concept of due diligence. So companies needing to actually demonstrate what they're doing, not just to put the right controls in place, but to make sure that those controls are being applied and there are structures in place to actually address those risks and identify those risks throughout the supply chain as well. And as we know, one of the pushbacks here in relation to the EU's legislation, there's some pushbacks in places like France and Germany where companies are saying, well, let's limit the scope of which companies this legislation applies to, so that it's not too disruptive in terms of how we do business. Essentially, when it comes to ESG reporting in this way, we need to think about questions of transparency and responsibility and effectiveness. So what are we doing to demonstrate transparency to the market, to ourselves? And then once we've made those discoveries, what actions are we taking to demonstrate responsibility? And thirdly, how are we measuring the impact of what we're doing? And measuring the effectiveness, the social impact, the environmental impact is not easy to do, simply because of the nature of impact measurement. We could be putting in place or conducting certain activities which we think are going to be of benefit, but they may have adverse effects elsewhere. So measuring the effectiveness of what we're doing is an ongoing and slow process. All right, I'm going to move on. The third issue to think about today is around cybersecurity, and this issue is one that does dovetail with the concept of human trafficking and modern slavery. Many companies these days are being impacted by all sorts of things such as scams, ransomware, phishing, for example, and so this is a growing issue. And those actors that are conducting these nefarious business practices are multiplying and multiplying in their effectiveness and their sophistication. One issue that's rising, and particularly in places in Southeast Asia, has to do with the rise of scamming compounds in places like Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. And here we're seeing a lot of tertiary educated young adults with ICT skills being coerced and in a sense trafficked into different scamming compounds where they're being put to work, employed to run this industry. So here we have a situation where people are being exploited in order to exploit, as a short way of saying that. And this is all being fueled by the profits that do come from trafficking. So profits from sex trafficking, for example, which yields a high profit globally, then is being layered into the development of these compounds. And this is a multi-billion dollar industry that's growing exponentially and contributing significantly to the GDPs of these countries. So we can see in terms of the different activities that they're being asked to do, there is some opportunism here where people are responding to certain advertisements. These can often be done by skilled fraudsters, and then they might actually accept the confinement in these compounds, which is a condition of the scamming. So there's a mixed there's a mixed sort of response to what this and why people might find themselves in these scenarios. But there are reports of use of torture, electric shocks, isolation, physical punishment as well. And this has a cost, a human cost, as well as a cost to different consumers. There's a quote there from in the Australian context. just in terms of the cost that it is to the economy around the annual scams as well. So it's a high growth industry. Just some quotes there. For example, from the UNODC. So it's the scam industry in one country in the Mekong region may be generating between 7.5 and 12.5 billion US dollars, which is half of this country's GDP. Head of Interpol says organized crime rings who fueled an explosion of human trafficking and cyber scam centers during the pandemic have expanded from Southeast Asia into a global network, making up to $3 trillion a year. And then we have some examples there, recent examples of how this is then tying into global markets. For example, the Singapore scandal in 2023, where there was a massive siege of assets worth 2.2 billion US dollars linked to a complex network of money laundering operations. So the issue of cybersecurity is one in which, yes, there are defensive measures that need to be taken by companies, and there's lots of conversations around that. How do we shore up our assets? How do we protect our data and the data of our customers? But we also need to be thinking through actually who is actually the mechanism, who is actually running these nefarious business practices that we need to be defensive against. And in that equation, we need to think through the regulatory controls that are in place that monitor the flow of money, how that money is being, say, laundered and layered into different nefarious business practices, such as scamming compounds, which is a human rights, demonstrating human rights violations. So a complex issue, but really just one in which shows the sort of the complexity of what we're looking at when we consider ESG. I think one of the issues that in terms of the backlash against ESG has to do with the fact that a lot of the conversation is around the environment. But if we actually look more comprehensively across the landscape, we can see that there's much more to consider than just the emissions piece, as large and as complex as that is. There's a lot that we need to consider in the social and the governance space as well. And that just hopefully will lead to more of what we need to talk today. We are low on time, and I know we need to get to more of the discussions. I have already alluded to some of these as well. So there are different reporting mechanisms that are in place. One being the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and Due Diligence Directive. And here we can see that one of the core elements are identifying and addressing the potential and actual adverse human rights and environmental impacts in the company's own operations. So this kind of legislation, probably in contrast to say what might be included in the Australian Modern Slavery Act, is actually requiring companies to actually drill deep, to conduct the due diligence and report on those due diligence activities, not just have the right governance and controls and identifying in a more hypothetical way where the risks might be, actually conducting in a more prescribed way, working out where those what is actually going on in our supply chain. And this, as I mentioned earlier, there's a slight pushback against this in terms of who and which kind of companies this applies to. Just to then open up our, just to try and end the presentation and just maybe open up the conversation, some of the pushback and pullback points that we might want to consider in our conversation today. Point one being the record ESG fund withdrawals. So we're seeing, therefore, there's one of the pullbacks has to do with the investment and the lack of confidence in ESG reporting. This is being, I suppose, trumped, sort of trumpeted in the US market, being led by the US market. So there's a pullback from those investments. In terms of, I suppose, the second point being the de-ESGing, so around renaming, rebranding, a retreat. So there's concerns here around the whole greenwashing or blue washing dynamic. How can we actually, how can we reframe this, because of the attitudes that have grown and the reputation that around that, around the whole concept of ESG. 3 being major players back away. So we're seeing, exiting of net zero asset managers, scrapped DI linked frameworks. So there's a pullback in the market in terms of investments that occurring from major players. There's the political and the legal backlash. So significant entities, for example, their climate disclosure rules were challenged in US courts. Most recently, there's farmer protests linked to the compliance costs. So it's the cost of actually compliance, which is disrupting business, and I suppose the backlash against the overregulation around sustainability reporting. In that, though, Australia is defying the trend because, as I mentioned earlier, we have climate-related financial risk disclosures, which is currently being rolled out, and so we're seeing companies committing to that, and Australia being a very compliant country in terms of business and committing to that as well. But given the size of the Australian market, what effect that's going to have globally is another question. So I suppose a key takeaway then to lead into the discussion is that ESG isn't dead, it's evolving. The term may be fading and needing some sort of maturing. And how can we actually then, I suppose the question is, how can we rebrand it, make it more real, more measurable, and into a new currency, into a new way of discussing the issue. So I'm going to just leave it there and just open up to any questions that people might have. I might just share my screen.
Yeah, and again,
respond to any questions
for this presentation. If you have, again, any questions for Stephen, feel free to click on the question mark button located at the bottom of the screen. This will open up the live Q&A tab where you can see the other questions as well, and you can ask your own question. Stephen, before we jump into those questions and I start to take them one by one, so this backlash that you're talking about, when you talk to the supply chain decision makers, the supply chain VPs, the procurement directors of leading corporation, do you sense that they are dealing with it? Are they telling you that there is a resistance right now among the board or maybe with the C-level management on ESG push, or what are they telling you?
Yeah, I think in the in terms of many of the companies that I work with, I think and the Australian context, I don't think the backlash is necessarily here. I think when it comes to, for example, the climate change and commitments to net zero, I think we're still on a commitment to that. The political discourse is mixed in terms of what we need to do, but I think there is an overall commitment to that. I think when it comes to the questions around the social domain, we are there's an uptake of in making sure that our workplaces, our operations are diverse. There's good representation, people being cared for. There's a lot of work done around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then on the governance side, I think the question of cybersecurity, I mean, it's every other day now in the Australian context that companies are being hit by some sort of data breach. And so I think there's some slowness around preparedness around that, but I think companies are being shocked into taking action. So I think when we look at more comprehensively at the issue, not just because ESG can be sort of substituted for environmental. So when people think ESG, they think environmental, but actually when we think about it more holistically, then there's a lot that companies are actually doing from my perspective. I think the backlash is definitely probably more overseas than in the Australian context.
And what will you tell a supply chain leader who's sensing this pullback or this resistance? How should they address it? keep pushing and insisting, or should they try to be more creative or innovative in finding ways to continue driving those programs?
Yeah, well, I think the pushback is, I think, around the environmental and how realistic it is to actually achieve those targets. So I think there's certainly a lot that could be done, that can be done, to focus on other areas that are not so controversial at the moment, to really ensure that they do have good practices in place. So I think the current backlash is going to be temporary. There's too much emotion for companies to just pull away from it. I think it could be that the backlash is just around the buzzword
Yeah.
of ESG, and we need to come up with a new way of talking about it. Um, and we need to talk about it in a way that's going to be more integrated and meaningful. But I think there's so much work that still needs to be done, even just putting in and making sure the right systems and controls are in place to protect company assets, to protect um, the data of their data, for example, their suppliers' data, their customers' data, and
Yeah.
then in the process also thinking through the experience of people and in the workplace.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because if you're looking at, again, I think supply chain sustainability, typically this is driven by the supply chain team, but sometimes they have also an ESG or a sustainability officer. And if you look at cybercrime, it's usually IT driven, right? So also there's, who's responsible and who's driving it. I think that's also probably an interesting discussion to have.
Yes, yeah, and I think what's probably being recognized in the more tech space is that cybersecurity is not simply just a tech issue. It's actually a governance
Mm.
issue.
Yeah.
So that's why it does need to, and it's a governance issue that has impact on people as well as the environment. So
Mm.
cybersecurity issues um, could actually, will it affect critical infrastructure, environmental infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, as well as not just people's personal private information. So it needs to move. So these issues need to move from people who are more, I suppose, social workers working with people, or technicians working on the technology, to into the governance conversation.
Okay. All right. Let's start to take the question. Let me put and spotlight them on the screen. Let's see whether it works. Hold on. It's going to come up hopefully.
There's a question there: is anyone actually using AI for ESG screening, or is it just a theory?
Yeah,
No, yeah.
we're gonna come to that. Hold on. I have a,
All right.
I'm trying to cue the
Oh,
questions
you're
right
trying to
here.
cue the
Yeah,
questions.
yeah. So I'm trying to get it down, but okay, it doesn't seem to be working for whatever reason. Okay, maybe I'll start. Yeah, okay, it's coming up. Okay, finally. This was my cue that I wanted to show. First question is, we are a small team. How to start basic ESG monitoring without a big budget?
Okay. So I think really, if you're a small team, and obviously I don't know what your industry you're in and what you're doing. So because I think, if, for example, we do work with small companies who are doing punching way above their weight. So an example of that is a company that is in the apparel merchandise sector, and they started their uh, journey, if you like, just looking at packaging, because they were importing products that were just, even just the smallest of products were just cladded in plastic wrap, and they thought, well, surely there's a better way of doing this. So they it was more of a discovery piece. I thought, let's look into our packaging, both as we receive products and as we distribute our products. And they were able to, in that process, do a lot of learning and work out how they can actually package things much more sustainably, and in the process educate their suppliers on how they could do that. So they would actually send the plastic back to the supplier saying, we don't want it. We've told you that.
Yeah.
We've shown you a better way. And in the process, there's an education piece as well. That led them to think through questions around dyes. What kind of dyes are they using for their inputs? and what ways can they recycle and upcycle different products that they have. And that then led them to a question around questions of, okay, so we're doing all these activities, but what controls do we have in place? So that led them to think through governance and policies and procedures, which then led to the conversation around training. So once you have your policies in place, you need to actually socialize them, implement them. So I think there's lots. I think because of there's so many things that need to be done. For them was actually working out how can they actually become a market leader or an expert in small things, which will then they could use to, in a sense, put in their brand, to say, this is what committed to, and by doing a few things well, that they could actually then speak to that intelligently rather than just getting sort of lost in a whole range of things that they couldn't really control.
Okay, all right. So let's move on to the next question. This question from Yanisa was asking, which ESG regulation do you think is the most urgent or critical to APAC companies in 2025?
I think actually the issue, I think cyber security is actually one of the biggest issues. I think in terms of business continuity, business disruption, the loss of assets, the cybercrime has just the tentacles of cybercrime are just enormous in terms of not just just shutting down your systems. If they can get into your computer systems and through ransomware, you can be paralyzed in business. So if you don't actually have, if your hardware is not secure, if your data is not secure, if the data of your suppliers and your clients is not secure, if the data, the financial, if the money that you have, those kind of intangible assets aren't secure, you're not in business. So I think actually, and this issue, which I touched on lightly, this is just growing and growing and growing. So the
Yeah,
sophistication around cybercrime is such that it has the potential to just shut down businesses and has the potential to also shut down whatever good work we're doing around the environment and other social dimensions.
yeah. And I think if you again ask people who are in supply chain roles, there seems to be a disconnect. They don't always seem to understand very well that risk. And like you said earlier, it's tend to be still very much an IT problem when they don't understand that obviously when you're dealing with suppliers and you have always in software and all those connection with all your suppliers, and a lot of things can go wrong in terms of cybersecurity, right?
Yep. And there's even a problem there around counterfeiting, so that your products may, in the shipping and the export of those products, they might have they've got certifications, certain tags, and those can be easily counterfeited, so and then be applied to other products. So even thinking through what happens when your product leaves your factory or your area of distribution,
Yeah.
um, is it protected?
Okay, let's move on. Again, if you have any other question, feel free to ask. I still see some questions coming in. We still have some time. So please click on that question mark button to ask your question to Stephen. Yeah. Let's move on to the next one. Question from Terry is, where are we with scope 3? Is this being delayed? Please share more details. Yeah.
Is it being delayed? I don't think it's necessarily being delayed. I think it's just something which is really complicated for companies to do. It's one thing to understand and calculate scope 1 emissions, which are the emissions of their own operations, their own factory. Scope 2 emissions being energy providers. And so again, those energy providers can also provide that information. Scope 3 emissions has to do with those in your value chain, principally your suppliers. So it's about then you're working with a range of stakeholders that you don't actually have control over, and they may not know even how to calculate their own
Yeah.
emissions. So you're relying on their level of sophistication to find it. So I think it's not something which is necessarily being delayed. I think it's just a question: how do we do this? How do we do this effectively? How do we do this meaningfully, quickly? I think it's around efficiency. How do we get this information when there's so much complexity in obtaining it.
Okay, all right. Let's jump to the next question. Uh, question from Aisha. What's a realistic first step to tackle modern slavery risk in our supply chain?
So I think you need to have an understanding of what you're looking at. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of governance and risk management and capacity and capability training, because I think it's because there's a range of stakeholders that need to understand what it is, what are we looking at, and how do we do that. I think having an understanding of what due diligence is about, what does it look like, what are the limitations, and then that would probably be the first step. The second step would be then to actually start scratching somewhere. So that's the kind of the maximum. There's the more you scratch, the more you'll find. But I think that's having an understanding of what we're looking at is the first level, because as you start conducting due diligence and engaging with civil society groups who might specialize in certain products, say for example electronics watch, for example, you will, having done some work, will be able to also engage with them more constructively, because the more you'll find yourself learning more as you go along. So it's a process of continuous learning, as you discover, explore, and work out actually what are the real risks. And the risk not just to our business but to the people working in our supply chain, and then thinking about, well, what does remediation look like? What does addressing those risks look like? So there's different levels of learning.
Okay, all right. Let's go to the next one. Someone is asking, we already have codes of conduct. Do they really work to push suppliers to change?
I think that comes down to how much leverage you have and how much engagement you have with those suppliers. So, like any policy, it's very easy to develop a policy and put it on file and forget about it. So it can be easily be a set and
Yeah.
forget. I think things like codes of conduct, contract clauses, supplier self-assessment questionnaires, I think they need to be couched in something more collaborative, relational, and something which generates a more partnership model with suppliers. So it's not just a top-down thing. Here's our code of conduct, line up. It's actually about working through those documents and actually helping them to understand and embody the values of those as well. So I think the good practice, and I think this is where it's most effective, is where companies actually create like different supplier forums. Maybe they do that by sector, and they actually have the conversation with suppliers and provide the opportunity, the rationale for these controls, what the reporting entity is trying to do, what are the obligations on them, and ways in which the supplier actually can partner with them to help them in this, and the ways that they'll benefit by doing so.
Do you have tools or systems that you can put in place to kind of scale those discussions? Because I see from very large corporations those supplier summits where they bring all their big suppliers into a nice five-star hotel for a day and just coach them and have this discussion that you're describing, but not everybody can afford it. And also, your suppliers might be in different locations. So can you do this online? Does that work? Have you seen this done successfully?
Yeah, I've seen it done both in person and online, and you can obviously set up certain toolboxes, digital toolboxes, where people can access those resources and create learning modules. I think so. There's probably two gears there. I think, obviously as much as possible, make it available, and create learning modules that people can then access whenever they want to access it. Um, but I think part of what could be missing then is the conversation. So I think when it
Yeah.
comes to, it's very easy to, and I know in my own experience, just to sort of do something online and then forget about it. So I think when you have the conversation, and there's that interpersonal connection, then it can actually create more of a culture change, which is kind of what you're looking for. You're looking for the culture change, the transformation piece, not just how many people have tick box that they've
Yeah.
received and understood our code of conduct, but actually how is their perception and behavior and skill level altered as a result. So more of those qualitative metrics.
No. Okay. All right. Let's go to the next question. Question from Nadia. How can we track ESG risk beyond tier one? Many of the suppliers don't even share full data.
Well, this is a great difficulty. So, in my experience working with companies in Australia and New Zealand, going beyond tier one is the great frontier, if you like. So it's not how do we do that? Well, we can do that. We can use technology, so screening tools to do that. So we can get that data through AI and international trade data. We can actually work out what controls are in place that the suppliers have, and then through a good governance mechanism, we can then become much more detailed through an engagement with the suppliers. So sometimes we can, the technology has been developed to harvest that information without the supplier actually giving it to us. So that's probably a good way, and that kind of technology will increase over time in terms of its level of sophistication and reach. But I think, part of the I suppose in my experience, it really comes down to the strength of the legislation. So the Australian legislation lacks the teeth to push companies to actually engage beyond tier one. So I think if
Yeah.
it did have teeth, then that would move companies to have that level of engagement. And it's really about the reporting entities taking responsibility to invest in those kind of activities, because that's long and that's a long piece and a bigger investment than they might be prepared to make.
Okay. All right. Here's the AI question that you were referring to earlier. A question from Brian, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier already. Is anyone actually using AI for ESG screening, or is it just theory?
Well, in my experience, yes. So I know of a number of digital solution providers that are offering this service, and they do have multiple clients, and they are accessing this technology. So they are screening their suppliers and getting a picture of a snapshot of where their suppliers where they're up to, and it really it kind of triages suppliers a bit, because it kind of means that they get this information and in a format, then they can start sort of identifying where the gaps are, and then that's what they can lead with. So rather than asking the suppliers 30 or 50 questions, they can ask them fewer questions because they already have the information. We already know this about you. What we're interested in is this, and this, because that will really help us. So it actually helps them to be much more targeted, so it's less onerous on the suppliers.
And have you seen good case of companies using tools like ChatGPT or to do this, or do you need to have specific systems in place for this?
Yeah, it's not large language models such as ChatGPT. It's more, different systems that companies are using to get this information.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a question on this a bit later. Let's jump to the next question. Uh, Someone is asking, our finance team see ESG as cost, how to shift that mindset?
Mhm. You have to build a business case. So absolutely, there's an investment component to it, but we need to see that as part of the cost of doing business. But really, what we need to do is formulate what is the business case, and the business case is what are the opportunities that come out of this in terms of enabling us to tender successfully with a government entity or a larger company, corporate, or go into a joint tender process, or work with a company in another jurisdiction. So I think we need to the challenge there is to develop the business case around what markets open, but also the business case around what kind of innovations come out of that as well. Because as, say, in the case of the apparel and merchandise company that I mentioned, by actually attending to single-use plastics, then they became a market leader in their sector, which then positioned them in much better, and they were able to then advise other companies on how to actually do packaging much more sustainably. So I think there's opportunity. The part of the business case is around market positioning, but I think it's and brand positioning, but I think it's also about opportunities for innovation and pivoting into pivoting your business, which is going to be essential for companies anyway. With the rise of AI, we'll need to if we're not pivoting now, we need to. So here's an opportunity to pivot and integrate technology in the process.
Okay. All right, we've got one more question before we wrap up. Yanisa is asking again, there are a number of web-based tools now for supply chain sustainability. Are they good? And which ones do you recommend?
Oh, I could be biased in that, so I don't know, I don't know if I should make that kind of recommendation.
I know
Um,
you wanted to cover that in the presentation, and maybe that's something we can do in the next session where you can talk about the different solutions. But very briefly, I mean, generally, do you find them good? Are they ready? Are they mature enough for to be used by supply chain leaders right now?
Yes, I think there is a level of certainly there's a level of maturity and growing maturity with these platforms. The platform that I use through one of my solution partners, Trace SCI. So it's a platform that they power. So it integrates different tools. So it integrates AI, it integrates international trade data, banking data. It's growing in terms of what it's offering around emissions calculating and the like. So that is growing, and and providing some really important data for companies to start. One around the pre-qualification, two in actually then in feeding into their reporting, so they can actually then show where they're up to and what they're doing, and what is I suppose what's the shape of their supply chain. What does it look like in terms of what the current status of different credentials and attributes is. It then becomes the starting point for more targeted conversations. So I think that's it's an excellent tool. It's being used by different companies and seen as an emerging leader in the market.
Yeah, it's probably it could be interesting, I think, for people to actually get an overview of a solution. So, if you're up to it, Stephen, we can probably organize a session like this where we can give a very kind of unbiased or kind of neutral overview of what's available out there
Yeah, what's
for
available in the
people.
market.
Yeah, exactly. All right, thank you very much again. That's about time. We need to wrap up. I want to thank you again, Stephen, for your time and for sharing your insight. It's definitely a good topic. There are issues, there's resistance, but I think people need to overcome it, and it's an important topic moving forward. I also want to thank everybody. Questions for today's session. If you missed part of it, if you came a little bit late, no worries. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it in the replay section of chain.net. And we'll again definitely organize some follow-up sessions on the same topic, and why not about those IT solutions out there. Thank you very much, Stephen, and again we look forward to see you next time.
Thank you, Max. Thanks everyone. It's been a great night. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.